Hello, and welcome to the Motivational Millennial Podcast, where we interview inspiring members of the millennial generation who are living life with a sense of purpose and achieving their dreams. I'm Blake Brandis.
And I'm Ivy LeClaire.
Our Motivational Millennial guest today is Chelann Gienger. Chelann was featured in Huffington Post and named in the top 40 millennial influencers to follow in 2018. At 21 years old, Chelann is a serial entrepreneur focusing her ventures on inspiring and empowering others to chase their dreams and goals in life. At the age of 18, she opened the NUYU Juice Bar along with 3 other partners in Yakima, Washington. Within a year of launching the Juice Bar, Chelann started the Entrepreneur Before 25 podcast, and at 20 years old, she published her first book, Dear Millennial, a compass to defining your unique purpose, pursuing a life of fulfillment, and building a legacy. Chelann, welcome to the Motivational Millennial Podcast.
I am so excited to be here today. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here with us. And we are so excited. When I first heard about Dear Millennial, I was like, holy cow, we are so on the same page. And we are looking forward to hearing more about your book and your journey today. And to start us off, would you mind telling us what you're up to at the moment and what you love so much about it?
Good question. Well, I'm a firm believer of you only live once, so love every second of every day as much as possible, even though, let's be real, sometimes it's a love-hate relationship, especially if you're an entrepreneur. Right now, I am primarily focused on NUYU Juice Bar. We are coming up on our 3rd year anniversary in June and hoping to open a second location in July. So that's really exciting, and the business is growing and doing amazing. And then I also host the Entrepreneur Before 25 podcast, which you mentioned in the bio. I get to basically speak with amazing young entrepreneurs all the time about their journey of entrepreneurship at such a young age, which I love. And then I also published Dear Millennial a few months ago, and that's been going great. So I have a lot of different things that I'm juggling right now, but I am passionate about every single one of them in their own special ways. And my day-to-day looks different every single day. But I think the important part is that you love what you do.
Amen to that. Can you take us on a little bit of a journey of how you got into entrepreneurship in the first place?
That's a good question. So I come from a very entrepreneurial family. And by that, I mean all my siblings and my parents are in some form of entrepreneurship. So when I was 15 years old is when I say it all started. I started my first official business, and it was a health coaching business. Yeah, people were letting me coach them on their health at 15. I've always been told I've been more mature than my age. So I think that's probably why that happened. Still don't know, honestly. But I come from a really entrepreneurial family. So my dad is what I call the Google of business and has had several successful businesses, and one of them was a very successful coaching business. So that was a huge advantage. And growing up, I was homeschooled actually until I enrolled in college at 16 years old through a thing called Running Start. I don't know if you or the listeners have heard of it, but basically you can enroll in college classes when you are a junior and senior in high school. So I wanted to become a dietitian. This was my goal because I had the health coaching business. And at some point I realized I'm going to have to put some credentials behind this to, move past this brick wall I'm running into. So at 16, that was my first real school, quote unquote, experience in a college classroom surrounded by, 20-year-olds and higher. So that's a whole nother story. That was pretty interesting. Then long story short, throughout that, the opportunity to open and own the Juice Bar came about. And then the podcast idea came about, which built on the Juice Bar as well. And then I wrote the book, which built on both the Juice Bar and the podcast. So my entrepreneurial journey has all just built one step on top of each other as far as being very related, very interesting, and a lot has happened in a short amount of time.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think your journey is so unique in that entrepreneurship was such a normalized part of your life. oftentimes when we're speaking with entrepreneurs, there's a huge learning curve and growing curve when you start a business because entrepreneurship also involves you having to put yourself out there in ways that you maybe never have before, having certain types of conversations. You have to do a lot of inner work. And so I'm curious to know how you think the journey may be different for you because it was in a way normalized sort of your whole life, and in what ways you do think that you've grown throughout your entrepreneurial journey.
Yeah, I've had a huge advantage as far as how I was raised. I think that our forming years as children largely affect our worldview, even as adults, no matter how much we grow or change or what our surroundings turn into. And so for me, I was, like I said, homeschooled, and so we had everything was very focused into what we were actually interested in. And on top of this, I grew up in the mountains to where for a while we would go to town, once a month. So my siblings, we were raised to be best friends. We were very limited on our intake of media and stuff. So a lot of our free time, we had to use our imagination with. We had to build stuff. We had to create stuff. And I was also taught at a young age that you can do anything. I was so blessed to be not raised at all with any self-doubt of anything but you can accomplish anything you want in this world if you work hard enough for it. And so I think you're totally right, Ivy. It's very different than a lot of people's stories. And I am so blessed, and I don't take it for granted, because launching into the real world, although it was kind of a shock at first, it's given me a huge advantage just in my perspectives. I work just as hard, if not harder, than anyone else. I face the same challenges and sometimes a lot more, but I have different perspectives on things that, when you grow up and become an adult, you have to be really intentional about keeping. So I have grown a lot in my entrepreneurial journey. I think that in order for your business to grow or your project to grow, you have to grow with it and beyond it. And I think that the biggest areas of growth that I've had to embrace was to learn to love change. I'm a really organized person. And so change, as you know, disrupts things and makes it so that I can't have all my ducks in a row. And, change is uncomfortable. And I had people and still have people in my inner circle who call me out on this. I had to realize that change is the way you grow. So that's a huge area I've grown in. And now, I have to be super intentional, but it's a lot easier to push change, to push into the uncomfortable. Another area of growth is growth itself. As an entrepreneur, you face so many challenges day in and day out. And, if you are committed to looking at every single thing you go through, good or bad, as a growth opportunity, it changes things dramatically. So in my life, through everything that, I face day to day, good or bad, like I said, I try to look at it as how can I grow from this? I recently went through something yesterday, for example. I was super stressed out and overwhelmed because I have a lot of big projects coming up in the next few weeks. And I was spending time with my business partners. When I'm stressed, it's not like I'm yelling or throwing things against the wall. I basically talk in a very monotone voice and I give shorter answers. Like I'm just trying to sort everything out in my mind. And our business partner relationship is based off of very authentic, real communication that hurts sometimes in the moment. And so I get with them, we're spending time together, running some errands. They were asking me some questions about stuff. And one of them looks at me and she's like, "Hey, Chelann, just being honest, I feel like you're taking your stress out on us right now." And you guys, it was so humbling, even though I've had multiple difficult conversations in business and in life. Every time it happens, it's still like, whoa, okay. And especially in the moment, right? But that's a perfect example where in the moment, like I paused, I processed what she just said, and then I like consciously had to think, okay, take yourself out of the situation. This is a great growth opportunity. So I've really just challenged myself to do that. And at first, I didn't do that at all. I would have a challenge that would happen and I would go victim to it and I would really let it affect me emotionally and take it on personally and kind of just like slash everything good and like look at everything as a failure if one thing went wrong. Cause I'm a very like black and white, all or nothing person. And so I think learning to love change, learning to view everything, good or bad, as a growth opportunity has been two of the primary ways where I've had to grow in my personal self with the businesses.
Well, that's a great example of self-awareness, I think,
Mhm.
to be able to receive feedback, to process it, to acknowledge the truth that is there, and to value what is your highest priority. And in this case, it sounds like your relationship with your business partners was definitely on the height of your priority list. You
Yeah.
mentioned a couple times in there some of the challenges along the way. I'm wondering if there is a particularly memorable challenge in your entrepreneurial journey that required you to either get creative or adapt or grow in some way?
The short answer is every day of life, right? But, in such a good way. I think for me, it would have to be being 18 years old. I had just graduated high school 3 days before, and I graduated with my associate's degree 2 weeks after we opened the doors of the juice bar.
Nice.
And I had never even had a real job before. So I had no standard for what was professional. I had done a ton of research and, we tried to know what we were doing, but we just had our holiday staff party last night and we were reflecting on, the beginning days and laughing so hard because we don't know how the business is where it is today based off of that. I think the hardest part in that was I started out with 4 partners and owning 25% of the business. And then over the course of 5 months, through a series of events, which we don't have time to go into, I became majority owner. And I was, still 18 at the time. The business was not in a good place. And all at the same time, in one day, the LLC was switched over, the bank accounts were switched over. We lost a manager. I took on 2 new partners, and I was a majority owner of what I call a newborn, like baby of business. That all happened in one day. And, at the time when you're young and you're in business, I think there's such an advantage because you're so naive that you don't know what you're getting yourself into. Because honestly, not now, but at the beginning, if I knew how much hard work it was going to be, I don't know if I would have done it because knowledge is power, right? I don't regret anything at all. But I think that was probably one of the biggest challenges because we had to transition the business. We had to change it from the inside out. I had to learn how to work with 2 new partners who I still have today. And I mean, such an amazing partnership. I'm so blessed. And along with that, I had to learn how to take ownership of my ownership and how to stand firm in decisions. Because before that, I was totally fine, totally comfortable with just being the one who did stuff. Like, oh, you don't really like my idea. Okay, I'm not going to stand by it. Let's just get stuff done. What do you want me to do? So I wasn't very vocal. And I remember the first time where one of my business partners was basically like, this is your call, Chelann. You need to call this, you need to call this meeting. And basically, you need to take ownership. And it was a huge light bulb moment for me because, I kind of felt insecure, I guess, in a way about it. I didn't want to be, the bad connotation of like a boss, the person who tells people what to do. I was just uncomfortable with anything that could possibly look like that because I didn't know what I was doing. That's the truth of it. So I think that would be the most challenging time towards the beginning. There's been a lot of other challenging times, but that one for me to learn that was absolutely essential to, be sitting here with you guys today.
So you have accomplished so many things. You have this amazing vast array of businesses and endeavors that you have achieved. And so I'm wondering, which of those accomplishments, when you look back on it, surprises you the most?
Definitely Dear Millennial. Definitely my book. If you had told me at this time last year, Chelann, you will be a published author before you're 21 years old, I probably would have laughed because I'm very goal oriented and it was never on my goal list, my life goal list, my bucket list, or even a thought in my mind that I would be a published author or, have a book, and especially a book like Dear Millennial that's so personal. I am a very authentic, real person, but, I think there's power in leaving like certain personal stuff not displayed to the world. And Dear Millennial has a lot of personal stuff in it. So that would be the accomplishment that definitely surprised me the most. And I think at the same time, it was funny when I was doing my goals for 2018, I also always reflect on the past year's goals. And there's definitely some big goals that at the beginning of 2017 were totally aligned with what I wanted to do, where I wanted to go that year, that didn't get done. And I was super, kind of like, oh, that's a bummer at first about that. And then I was like, it's okay. I published a book. That's at least 2 points, right? But yeah, that would definitely be the most surprising.
What parts of the book felt either most vulnerable or most challenging for you as you were writing it?
That's a good question. Definitely the parts about my romantic relationships. I was so hesitant. To be honest, I wrote the entire book. And keep in mind for the listeners, this book, the whole purpose, it's for millennials by a millennial, calling the millennial generation to a higher standard of greatness. And the biggest focus and niche there was I am a peer talking to peers. We have so many older people who are telling millennials this and that, but I am a peer, a millennial just like you, and I'm not asking you to do or consider anything that I'm not already doing myself. So I knew that. And then I wrote this entire book and I gave it to my sister-in-law, and she was the first person that read it. And she was like, this is really good, Chelann, but there's hardly any personal stories in here. I was like, yeah, I know. Isn't that great? I definitely did have stories in there, but they weren't nearly what they are now. So I went back to work. I doubled the size of the book and I wrote a story, if not a couple stories, that would show the reader how I implemented what I'm telling them to in the book. And I loved the book after I wrote those stories. It became alive to me because stories are so powerful. They have such a magical way of making us be able to relate to each other. We're all human. I'm human. You're human. I'm not above you. You're not above me. And they're just so beautiful. So in doing that, it was incredibly hard for me because a good story has a really bad point and a really good point. So I had to write about the really bad points. And for me, I was raised pretty conservative with the mindset that both of my siblings who are married, they dated one person and then they married them. And my story with that has been different. And I've been through 2 very short relationships, but still I'm a very, like I mentioned, all or nothing person. So they really, really impacted me. 2 relationships where I had to really do the hard thing when, I don't know many other people who would. And I had to look at it and say, is this the person that I want to build a legacy with? In doing that, I also, when you write stories, nobody tells you this. when you're writing a book, when you're writing stories, most of the time they're going to involve other people. And so I was writing a very fine line there as well, where I had to be super real with myself, do several self-checks and ask myself, Chelann, is any part of you stating it this way, forming the sentence in this way, in a way that is a slight jab or bitterness, because that was not my intention at all.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew everyone mentioned in the book was probably going to read the book or hear about the book. I'm not into people pleasing whatsoever, but I am into honoring and respecting individuals, even when they maybe don't necessarily deserve it. It really grew me a lot. It was probably one of the hardest parts, but I had to be mature and real with myself with these stories as well. So that was probably, no, most definitely like the hardest part about writing the book.
Well, thank you so much for doing that, because I'm sure that it has added just some real depth and vulnerability to it. And that takes a lot of bravery. So, that's so awesome. I'm wondering, we often ask our guests what advice that they would like to give to other millennials. And you have such a unique perspective, because that's one of the things that you do is orient about how to give what kind of advice you would like to give to millennials. So I'm really wondering if you were able to go back to the Chelann who was really young and very beginning on this whole path toward creating fulfillment, creating success. I guess I'm wondering, what would she really need to hear? What is the thing that you would really want her to know?
This is an interesting question for me, because that wasn't that long ago for me. I mean, at the
Sure.
most it was, 6 years. So I'm still growing. I'm still learning. I always want to be. But I think that I would tell that Chelann to enjoy the process and be present in that process. That, success is not a destination whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
It's the journey. And so if you, Chelann, are just trying to reach that goal and that success, but you're not enjoying the journey, you're not going to enjoy any of that. And I am definitely, like a lot of people, my biggest critic, and I can be extremely, excruciatingly strict and hard with myself when I don't perform 100%, when, because I'm a huge take ownership person, which I'm sure we'll get into later. But I would also say to give yourself grace and understand that there is always going to be a second chance. I would also tell her to define what success means for her and her life, and then choose those top priority spheres of success, health, relationship, and business, and set goals within them and make them happen. And in the process, give yourself grace and live in the present moment of that process. And a huge one too would be to be confident in the things that you know to be true about yourself. It's so easy to let our confidence and who we are be defined by other people and our atmosphere and what's around us. I think for a long time I struggled with really defining who Chelann Gienger was, because I come from a very established family and, community. When you grow up like that, that kind of defines you. And then when you take yourself out of that community, you're kind of like, okay, who am I? So I would say define that and stick to it, and don't make apologies for who you are, but know that you can always take advice and input, but that doesn't have to define exactly who you are. You need to define that for yourself.
Amen to that. You mentioned a little bit about taking ownership. Did you want to say a little more about that?
Yeah, I feel like on most podcasts, you usually ask what the favorite book is. And I was going to mention that book for me, Extreme Ownership. I don't know if you guys have read it, but it's by Jocko Willink and Leif Babin. They're two ex-Navy SEALs turned business coaches. And I actually mentioned this book in my book because it was so influential. And the whole concept of the book is to take ownership of every single area of your life. My favorite quote from this book is, "Leaders must own everything in the world. There's no one else to blame." And this concept literally rocked every single part of my life because no longer in the business, in my personal life with myself, would I let myself go victim and say, life is just happening to me, but always life is happening for me. This situation is going to work for me. And next time I didn't accomplish a goal, I wasn't just going to be like, oh, okay, that's fine. It's because of this, this, and this. I was going to be like, okay, why didn't I accomplish it? How can I fix it? And how can I make sure that this doesn't happen again? Even in the business, I do my very best to take ownership of every single thing that happens in there. Now, that doesn't mean I'm hovering over everything and not empowering people. But it means if I'm like in San Diego at a conference and I hear that a customer was unhappy with their drink for some reason, even though I'm thousands of miles away, had nothing to do with it, I need to make sure that I take ownership of that situation because in some way, shape, or form, I failed to delegate, failed to train, failed to create a system. And it's my job to make sure that that situation gets completely solved so that it doesn't happen again. I don't know if I got this from extreme ownership, but I love this analogy of in your business, this is the kind of leader I strive to be. In your business, when something is going right, when something's going amazing, look out the window to your team. And when something is going wrong in your business, look in the mirror. And it doesn't mean that I'm taking on any of this stuff personally. It's meaning I'm not looking at my manager or the other owners and being like, this is definitely your fault and I had nothing to do with this, so you fix it. It's like, okay, what happened here? How can we fix it together? There's definitely a fine balance. I was really extreme in this, in sometimes in an unhealthy way at first. And so I think you need to work in some grace with it and make sure you're not like constantly in fix it mode because that can get exhausting. But I think it's the perspective and the mentality that's important about it.
I think that's a really amazing perspective to have. And I'm glad that you added that little point at the end about not taking it to the extreme. I was going to ask about that. I imagine that it takes a lot of strength to take ownership, and it takes a lot of strength to take ownership and not turn it into beating yourself up. Have compassion for yourself and for your team, through that process. And so that's really cool. I'm wondering, some of this is going to be based on your personal experience, probably conversations that you've had, but what do you feel like are some of the unique challenges and or opportunities that members of the millennial generation face?
Interesting question. My personal opinions on challenges in general when it comes to your gender, your race, what generation you're part of is to shift it and instead of looking at it as a challenge, looking at it as an opportunity, because I think that there's a flip side to everything. I think that when something's challenging, there's also an advantage to be found. So let me preface it by that first. And then I'll say that with the millennial generation in general, this is a hard one because there is definitely a lot. But at the same time, I think there are some advantages. Like I said, if you're a millennial, there are some difficult, a lot of times not true things said about the millennial generation, that you're lazy, you can't stick with something. There's so many things. But then there's also the flip side. And we have the people that I get to interact with the most who are sometimes so much in the hustle zone that they like drive themselves into the ground. And that's a huge thing my podcast speaks to is the hustle mentality, like hustling and hustling and hustling can eventually destroy like everything in your life if you're not careful. And that's a rabbit trail that we can go down if we want. But I was thinking about this, and I think like the most unique challenge that I can think of right now, and this is especially from personal experience, is we have so many resources and technology opportunities. It's just never been easier to put yourself out there. So, the millennial generation, the majority of us, we live our lives in a very public way, extremely public. With that is incredible opportunity. And I think it's absolutely amazing. And I think that these days, unfortunately or fortunately, if you don't have an online presence, you are way less of a credible person. I think it also has some disadvantages that we should at least be aware of so that when we face them, we can recognize them and be like, oh, this is happening. I'm going to get back on track here. But for me, I think that when you're in such a, public space, when everyone's watching you, it's really difficult to stick to your truth and who you are. And most of all, stick to your values and not veer off of those. And I think that's why we're seeing so many millennials literally go in every direction at once and totally not draw a line on who they are and what they believe. They would almost rather say, okay, well, I believe in everything because I want to love everyone and I want to support everyone and I don't want to condemn everyone. And this is a really touchy subject because I think that people are defining love differently these days. But I don't view love as, okay, well, I can't have any values myself, or I have to believe everything you believe in order for you to be loved. And so I think when things are in such a public space and we're seeing everyone's life, everyone's highlight reel of their life, it's really hard to remember who we are as an individual. And you have to be 10 times more intentional these days as millennials to do that. And that's why in Dear Millennial, I talk about, okay, how do you define your purpose? How do you define your mission and your values and your truth? And then how do you stick to that? Because I think that we're going to see a pattern if we're not going to get more intentional about this in the next 10 years of pretty big disasters because millennials aren't drawing lines, for lack of a better term. And I would actually like to hear your guys' opinion on this just like a tiny bit. I love talking to millennials about this, and I've had some good and also very heated conversations about, personal values and drawing a line in that and sticking to what you believe. So what do you guys think? Do you agree with the whole, because of social media and all that, it is harder to stick to those things?
Well, I think that any conflict is usually a conflict about values at its fundamental base. And so what I think social media has done has expanded in some ways the types of values that are in conversation. And I think that's actually a good thing because I think there were a lot of assumptions that have been made throughout history about what values are and who shares them and why they share them. So I think to the extent that we're having civil dialogue around them, that is a positive thing. I think, unfortunately, what tends to happen, and this is both an algorithmic problem and a social problem, is that we increasingly insulate ourselves to not want to discuss values that may be unpalatable with other groups of people, and for good reason. I think, how many times has a Facebook comment changed your opinion on something you value? Probably never, right?
Yeah.
But has it made you mad? I'm sure it has. So,
right.
So I think social media is not the right venue to have conversations that change people's values. I think hopefully what it is a venue where people can learn more and understand more about each other. So that to me is the real value in it, and no pun intended, and where I try to maintain exposure to other points of view, because frankly, it's so interesting to be in a space without judgment and just listen to what other people are saying, why they're saying it, and what pieces of information have to be true for them to believe that. And not to get political, but some of the most interesting research done on the past election not just the past election, even in 2012 too, shows that the information that you consume totally defines what worldview is real for you. And so I think just being aware of it is really important. So I say it would all start with awareness. And that's my long answer. Ivy, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I appreciate that you kind of brought up the point about, the ability to sort of ignore or isolate yourself, to only have people in your feed or that you're connecting with that already have shared values. And so I think that can be not necessarily a good thing. I don't know. I feel like it's good to expose yourself to ways of thinking that you may not have otherwise done before. I mean, I know for myself, some of the ways that I got into and was exposed to feminist ideas, which are now really important to me, were because of people on Facebook sharing things. I wouldn't have otherwise known to access those certain,
right.
blogs or whatever. In regard to your question about standing up for your own values, I mean, I think that's really important, because it's just an interesting question too for me, because I've lived all over the place, and it's great because sometimes we forget, if we stay and live in only one area, in my experience, we tend to feel like that's the cultural norms and the values that are in the place where you live is the only way to live life as a human being. And so I think it's really great to expose yourself to living in different areas. I eventually like to live in different countries to just get these different perspectives. Yeah. But in regards to social media, it took me a long time to get to where I felt comfortable really sharing my opinions online, particularly when they were on hot button issues. And always when sharing my opinions, I'm doing it in a respectful, compassionate way is my intention, because I don't agree with berating people or mistreating people for having different values than you. And I don't think that helps. But I was always afraid of people not liking me because I'm saying I really care about this issue and this is how I feel about it. And, just by sharing an article or a video or a perspective. So that for me was a growing area. You have the luxury of creating and curating your identity online. And for me, it's been a conscious choice to not just be ambiguous about everything,
right.
And that's been important to me, actually, to do that.
Yeah. And I think the main thing I see is, I guess I would just like to see millennials walking the talk more, whatever their talk is, whatever their values are, not necessarily even on social media. Actually, I'm talking about in real life, when I'm sitting face to face with you, because people can talk all they want, but it's not until I actually see you doing something that I'm going to believe it. And I mentioned some of the relationships I've had. That was the main thing, was I got to know this person in theory, and then I saw X, Y, and Z, these people living their life in a way that was literally the opposite. And then I started looking at so many people in the millennial generation, because we can have kind of two lives in a way, our social media presence where everything's curated and we have time to think about our responses, then in real life. So I think that's probably like the main point that I want to draw out in my previous answer, which, you guys really spoke well to that as well. So defining what you value, your truth, and then not only projecting that in social media in a way that you're comfortable with, but also in real life.
Well, and this ties in with what you were saying about extreme ownership too. I know we got to wrap it in a second. But, I think extreme ownership is really about looking at your life and saying, where am I in alignment with my values? Where am I out of alignment with my values? And what can I do to restore my own integrity in that process? And that can be really hard. That could be one of the most confronting things we do, because of course,
you have to be real with yourself.
Yeah, you gotta be so real. That's so painful.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I think it's one of the best feelings in the world, because you can truly look at yourself in the mirror and be like, for everything else that is not going right, at least this part is in alignment.
Yeah.
Well, Chelann, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today and for sharing your wisdom. Would you mind sharing with our audience where they can find out more about you and your work online?
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Online, you can find me at Chelann Gienger. That's my social handle on every platform. I think I have every main platform. And that's ChelanNGienger. And then you can find Dear Millennial on Amazon if you want to check that out. And you can also find kind of a curation of just everything at ChelannGienger.com.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you guys so much. This has been awesome.
For show notes and previous episodes, or to learn more about our coaching and event offerings, visit motivationalmillennial.com. That's millennial, MILLENNIAL. Keep in touch with us at facebook.com/motivationalmillennial.
We'd love to hear from you. Shoot us an email with your thoughts, comments, and suggestions at podcast@motivationalmillennial.com. And tell us who you might like to hear from, or if you think you or anyone you know would be good for the show.
Our theme music was composed and performed by our very own Blake Brandis.
The Motivational Millennial Podcast is edited by Brittany Felix. Have a great week, Motivational Millennials!